with Chris Cuomo and Allison Camerata.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to your new day. We do begin with breaking news for you because Jared Kushner has put out an 11-page statement saying that he did not collude with any foreign government. The president's son-in-law and senior advisor he will be facing tough questions on his contacts with Russia in just hours when he meets with the Senate Intel Committee.
It's a very well-crafted 11 pages, and it certainly outlines all contacts from Kushner's perspective with Russian officials, including what he knew about that meeting with the Russian attorney that Don Jr. invited him to. Now, the question this morning is going to be that what will the impact be of Kushner's answers on investigators, especially when you get to the special counsel and, of course, Congress? We have it all covered. Let's begin with CNN Justice correspondent Pamela Brown live in Washington with the breaking details. This is an unusual circumstance, but these 11 pages are what Kushner wants the investigators to believe when he meets with them.
That's right. He wants this for the public record as well. And this is the first time, Chris and Allison, that President Trump's senior advisor and son-in-law Jared Kushner is sharing his side of the story about his Russian contacts. And he said in this 11-page statement, flat out, I did not collude nor know of anyone else in the campaign who colluded with any foreign government. I had no improper contacts. I have not relied on Russian funds to finance my business activities in the private sector. And he insists that he had no additional meetings with Russians other than the 4 contacts that had been reported already, though he did provide fresh details about these meetings. He says besides a quick meeting quick meet and greet with Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak last April at a reception at the Mayflower Hotel, the only other Russian contact during the campaign was the now infamous meeting at Trump Tower with his brother-in-law Don Jr. Kushner claims he did not read down that email chain whereby Don Jr. is told that he would be receiving incriminating information from a Russian attorney about Hillary Clinton. Kushner claiming he would get hundreds of emails a day during the campaign, and he just didn't read through each email, including this one. And he also tried to emphasize in the statement how he viewed the meeting as meaningless, saying, quote, reviewing emails confirmed my memory that the meeting was a waste of our time, and that in looking for a polite way to leave and get back to my work, I actually emailed my assistant from the meeting after I had been there for 10 or so minutes and wrote, can you please call me on my cell? Need excuse to get out of meeting. He says there was no follow-up that he's aware of, no knowledge of documents being offered. He says the only thing he remembers was a discussion about adoption. He then went on to detail what he said was the second meeting with Ambassador Kislyak during the transition, saying Kislyak wanted to meet with him to address U.S. policy in Syria. He says during that meeting, Kislyak asked for a secure line to conduct the conversation with generals in Moscow. Kushner told him, according to the statement, there wasn't a secure line at the transition headquarters, so he asked if it was possible to use existing communication channels at the Russian embassy. Kislyak said that wouldn't be possible, and nothing happened after that, Kushner says. Clearly, he is pushing back on any notion that he wanted a secure back channel to Moscow. After that, at Kislyak's request, he met with Sergei Gorkov, the head of the Russian state-owned bank, VEB, who had a direct connection to Russian President Vladimir Putin. Kushner says that meeting lasted about 20 minutes, and he claims it was only about relationship building as part of his role in the transition, and that no personal business was discussed. That contradicts a statement from VEB that says this meeting was about Kushner's business. So clearly, in this 11-page statement, Jared Kushner is painting this picture that these contacts with Russians during the campaign and the transition were meaningless and insignificant in his view. Back to you, Allison.
Pamela, there's so much to parse in this 11-page statement. Thank you very much for diving in and analyzing all of that for us. So there are mixed messages coming from the White House on whether the president supports another big story event that will be happening this week, this bipartisan bill in Congress that would punish Russia for interfering in the U.S. election. CNN's Joe Johns is live at the White House with that part of the story. What's the latest, Joe?
Good morning, Allison. You know, it was recently, not long ago, that the White House was lobbying against that bill to punish Russia for meddling in the last election. Now there's pressure mounting on Capitol Hill to do something, which could mean the president's going to find himself in a no-win situation. All this when the newly retooled communications team here at the White House went out to talk about it over the weekend. There was more mixed messaging.
President Trump's new communications team offering muddled messaging about whether the president supports a bill that will limit his ability to unilaterally lift sanctions on Moscow. Newly appointed Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders signaling the president is open to signing the legislation.
The administration is supportive of being tough on Russia, particularly in putting these sanctions in place, and we support where the legislation is now.
But incoming White House Communications Director Anthony Scaramucci sounding more uncertain.
Is President Trump going to sign the Russian sanctions bill?
We got to ask President Trump that. You know, it's my second or third day on the job. My guess is that he's going to make that decision shortly.
The new communications director also telling CNN that President Trump still does not accept that Russia attempted to influence the 2016 election.
He basically said to me, hey, you know, this is, maybe they did it, maybe they didn't do it.
A stark contrast to the unanimous and unwavering beliefs reiterated by President Trump's own intelligence officials in the last week.
There is no dissent, and I have stated that publicly.
Everyone's on board.
And I've stated it to the president.
I am confident that the Russians meddled in this election, as is the entire intelligence community.
No doubt at all, and I stand behind the intelligence community assessment that we produced.
With 3 of his inner circle scheduled this week to speak with congressional investigators looking into possible collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, the president unleashing his anger at both political parties, once again calling the investigation a phony witch hunt and an excuse for a lost election, while attacking fellow Republicans for doing very little to protect their president. The president raising eyebrows a day earlier by asserting he has the complete power to pardon, suggesting that might include his family, his aides, even possibly himself in relation to the Russia probe.
I'm in the Oval Office with the president last week. We're talking about that. He says he brought that up. He says, but he doesn't have to be pardoned. There's nobody around him that has to be pardoned.
One of President Trump's lawyers offering a contradictory message.
We have not and continue to not have conversations with the President of the United States regarding pardons. Pardons have not been discussed, and pardons are not on the table.
The House is expected to take up the sanctions bill as early as tomorrow. The New York Times is reporting that when they reached out to Scaramucci to ask him about the confusion over the president's position on the bill, he told them he was still new to the information. Allison and Chris.
Joe, thank you very much for all of that. We'll talk about it with our panel. Let's bring them in. We have CNN political and national security analyst David Sanger, Bloomberg News White House correspondent Margaret Talev, and former U.S. Undersecretary for Political Affairs, Ambassador Nicholas Burns. Great to see all of you. David Sanger, I want to start with you. If you read this 11-page statement, this extraordinary statement from Jared Kushner in the first person, in his own words, do you read it as someone who was confronting a steep learning curve, somewhat over his head in his new role as senior advisor, had a lot on his plate, and so a lot of things like what he says were casual meetings with Russian officials slipped through the cracks, and that's all there is there?
Well, certainly, Allison, the way he's trying to portray himself in this 11-page document is as somebody who was completely new to foreign affairs, couldn't remember after he had met him the name of Sergei Kislyak, the longtime Russian ambassador to the United States, who suggested at one point, Kushner himself said he suggested that if they needed to set up a secure communications line to the Russians, that maybe they should go to the Russian embassy in Washington and use their phone lines to go do that. I've never been in the Foreign Service, but our fellow panelist Nick there has, and I suspect there are people in the Foreign Service world and certainly in the counterintelligence world who would have a problem with that. So his defense here is basically, I was overwhelmed and a little naive about how all of these happened. I didn't know who I was meeting. I think the most interesting part, Allison, was his description of the Donald Trump Jr. meeting with the Russian lawyer and the parade of other Russians who were there. He maintains the part he was in was mostly about adoptions, that as you heard, he wanted to get out of the meeting early. But what he's missing is that the purpose of that meeting, if you talk to people who've done Russian counterintelligence, was mostly to see if the Trump campaign, or the transition at that point, was, the campaign at that point was receptive to getting information about Hillary Clinton, to receiving Russian government data about Hillary Clinton. That's what the meeting was all about, and he seemed to have missed that by his own account.
And one of the interesting revelations about Don Jr.'s emails, Nick, is that it shows that it's not a hoax. It's not a witch hunt to be asking these questions, because the Russians were obviously trying to move on people close to the president. Now, Jared Kushner gives himself some space on that meeting. He says, I showed up late. So whatever was said before the adoption, I don't know. I wasn't there. That's the implication of the statement. But as someone who does have such profound knowledge of foreign service, to David Sanger's point, he presents himself as overwhelmed and naive. Is that good enough for you?
Well, I think that's the key question for the Senate Intelligence Committee and for the special counsel. Chris, I think that the major thing here that I would like to relate today is how strange and bizarre it was that the Trump campaign spent so much time thinking about Russia. They were running for election in the United States. It's not unusual for campaigns of either parties to have incidental contacts with foreign officials just to get to know them, to exchange views. But to have this repeated focus by the campaign chairman, by the president's son, by the president's son-in-law, by the president himself on Russia, I find strange and bizarre.
Jared Kushner says in his statement he had very little contact with Russia. Yet he didn't even remember the ambassador's name.
But look at the campaign in total. And Chris, what the most important thing here are the statements that Donald Trump made as candidate and now as president. He's rejecting the intelligence community's assessment of whether Russia hacked our election. He's been doing that since the autumn. He has repeatedly excused what the Russians have done in Ukraine and Crimea. He hasn't even been for the sanctions that nearly every other Republican has supported on both of those issues. He is the weakest president we've had on Russia. I think that's the central story from a policy perspective.
Margaret, you've had a chance to read through this. Let me read for our viewers one of the salient moments, and this is Jared Kushner talking about that Russian attorney that Don Jr. set up the meeting with. I had not met the attorney before the meeting nor spoken with her since. I thought nothing more of this short meeting until it came to my attention recently. I did not read or recall this email exchange before it was shown to me by my lawyers when reviewing documents for submission to the committees. What do you see here, Margaret?
Yeah, when you look in totality at this 11-page statement, it attempts to do at least two things. One is completely distance him from any notion that Hillary Clinton and her, fate in the election entered his calculus. And two is to sort of preemptively state that his own business interests, that the Kushner companies were not tied up in his thinking at all about this meeting with the bank chief, the Russian bank chief who had the connections with Vladimir Putin. There is so much material in this 11-page statement, but these are two kind of parallel points that I think are really important to understand that he is underscoring. And the third is, as all statements attempt to do, to set the narrative going into this interview with this Senate panel. As we know, this is a sort of an unusual arrangement. It's not what we think of as typical committee testimony. It's happening behind closed doors. It is not happening under oath, and it is with staff, but they will have a chance to ask him questions, and this is his opportunity to try to set the parameters of those questions and to shape the staff's thinking before that meeting actually begins.
But Kushner doesn't have to be under oath to
tell the truth.
Too vulnerable. Well, right, you can tell the truth no matter what, and you can be punished for not telling the truth without being under oath before Congress. And he also is the only one who has any onus on him. He's a member of the administration. Right. Manafort isn't, Donald Jr. isn't, so he had disclosure responsibilities, and that'll be part of the questioning today. But there are other issues as well. David Sanger, what do you make of the president's posturing on the sanctions bill? We get it. We get it from Anthony Scaramucci. When he hears Russian interference, he hears, I'm illegitimate. So he doesn't like it. He rejects it. Doesn't matter how many people say Russia interfered. He's going to fight it. This sanctions bill puts him in a little bit of a pickle, but could he not sign this? I mean, haven't members of his own party told him, we're going to override your veto on this? It matters to us?
Well, Chris, I don't think he's got a choice here. First of all, in this political atmosphere, if he vetoed this bill, first significant piece of legislation to reach his desk as president, maybe the only piece of significant legislation that will reach him in this session of Congress, he would be in the position of appearing to do Vladimir Putin's bidding. Because this bill is exactly what both President Trump in his interviews with us last year at the Times and what Vladimir Putin want to avoid. Mr. Trump said in those interviews that he thought that the sanctions that had been imposed after the annexation of Crimea and the military action in Ukraine were an impediment to building up a better relationship with Russia. He didn't quite go so far as to say he wanted to get rid of it, but that was the implication. Now, this legislation actually expands the sanctions. It doesn't do it in a very dramatic way, but it certainly puts specific sanctions on individual Russians and entities for the election hack. So by signing the bill, which I think he's going to have to do, he is basically acknowledging that the Russians were responsible for the hack. I don't think that will change in any way his continued effort to sort of muddy that up. And as you say, the reason for that is clear. He is not capable of, in his own mind, of saying they tried to interfere in the election and it probably didn't affect the outcome. He's a legitimate president anyway. All he hears is this is a way to attack his legitimacy.
And once and for all, we can say it's not us speculating about it. His own comms director said that the president, this is his reckoning of it. So
that's right.
It's not speculation. It comes from the White House.
Panel, thank you very much for